Hi, everyone. I'll give you a moment to connect to sound. Hello, and welcome to the Broken Rails 1125th New Social Environment. I'm Min, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Devin T. and Max Tolleson on the occasion of FACSIMILE at the Power Station, Dallas. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Devin T. uses sculpture, performance, and pictures for pleasure. His use of the temperamental is an attempt to work with the materiality of everything and nothingness. He often refers to his practice as a place for things to become things. And our host, Max Tolleson, is a critic in residence at the core program in Houston, Texas, and has published scholarship and art criticism with various publications. While living in Marfa, Texas, he researched and wrote about the history of the Chinati Foundation in relation to minimalism, environmental theater, critical regionalism, and the politics of display. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Max to get us started.
Thank you, man, so much for that wonderful introduction. And before we begin, I just want to thank Chloe Stackman for accepting my pitch for this talk today. And I want to thank Devin for agreeing to participate. I'd also like to just acknowledge that this talk is taking place the day after a very anxiety-fueled election here in the US. And I cannot help but think about that at the same time that I'm also thinking about Devin's practice. And perhaps one thing that many of you will come to discover about Devin's work, if you don't know already, is that Devin's his practice is incredibly engaged with the process of engagement, like how the artist attends to the world of objects, of the world of spaces around us. And so perhaps one thing, if any, that we can take away from this talk is maybe a moment to reflect on critically think about the actions we take and the choices we make as artists, citizens, and human beings. So I just want to also mention before we get started that I met Devin here in Houston about 15 months ago. This is where we both work. And we've been having these dialogues over the past year that I feel like have been really interesting and productive. And during that time, I've seen 4 exhibitions that Devin's put together here in Texas, some of which we'll talk about today. But Devin's been incredibly prolific over the past year, and he's been doing exhibitions elsewhere as well, in Europe as well as Chicago, some of which we'll also talk about today. Ultimately, we're going to end with a discussion of FACSIMILE, which is an exhibition currently on view at the Power Station in Dallas, Texas. And Devin and I had started, or at least we had thought about starting today with showing you an excerpt from a video that is currently on view at the Power Station that Devin created. And so before we do that, Devin, is there anything else you want to add before we show the video?
No, I think we should just get into the video.
All right, let's do it. Thanks, man. So, Devin, when I see your work, what often comes across most to me is not just the thing that you're observing, but the way you observe it. And I was wondering if you could kind of tell us a little bit about this performance you were attending that we just saw, and how you approached the making of this video.
Sure. The Thank you for that. The slide we're looking at now is of Baker's Keyboard Lounge, which is located in Detroit, Michigan, which is my hometown and not very far from where I grew up. The occasion was I was in Detroit for a funeral, actually. It was my uncle's funeral, and it was in March of this year. And during that weekend of being home, the suggestion kind of came about, which is always the thing that happens when I'm at home, is to visit bakers as a staple in the kind of neighborhood in the city, wanting to kind of like ground myself a bit there. Not necessarily for performance all the time, sometimes just to kind of be in the environment, to share a drink, conversation, laughter with a family member, my aunt, my mother. And this particular day, we went to Baker's, and the drummer who you see, the name is Shirazette, they weren't supposed to be there that evening. They were stepping in for somebody else. And to be inside Baker's Keyboard Lounge, because it's such an old place, it's not a place that I would say the area for performance is not kind of pronounced in a particular way. It feels very much kind of you're entering a dining space that then there's an area where people can kind of like play music or perform or do stand up. But I would say the stage feels less pronounced than it does in other kind of like more performance spaces. And because of that intimacy, you feel like you're kind of right up against the performer. And so during this performance, what Shirazette was having wasn't a solo. There's a quartet, which you can't see. Maybe you get a glimpse of a saxophonist kind of coming in. There's also another member of the band that kind of comes into view. But there's a moment where it's obvious something is happening with Shirazette. And I begin recording just as a kind of natural, maybe response to kind of seeing something interesting. You're just kind of like, oh, this is an interesting thing to kind of like experience and document. But there was a moment of maybe about a minute into the video, just so you know, too, for people who are watching, the video is 8.5 minutes in length, which is about the length of the time Shirazette was playing, kind of in this, or getting into this drum solo. We watched about 4 minutes of it. And I would say right around maybe the minute into kind of me recording Shirazette, I realized it was more than just kind of me documenting her getting into whatever the thing she was getting into. It was also a moment of me realizing that I was like getting into making a video. I become more formal. I become more aware of my body. I become more aware of the things happening within the kind of places that I've cropped and I've framed, whether it's like the St. Patrick's Day decorations that say lucky right above her head, or noticing kind of people coming in and out of the kitchen, which is kind of that door that's swinging open and close. And so it becomes a really interesting kind of relationship that I think I'm having with Shirazette, making the video of her and sitting there for 8.5 minutes, not really saying anything to the other people I'm at the table with at the time, just trying to be as still and as silent as I possibly can to kind of get there or be there with her. And once the video was made, I didn't really look at it again. This was in, like I said, before March of this year. I thought about it. I may have talked about it, remembered it, but I didn't spend any time with it again until FACSIMILE came up. And that's what gave me the opportunity to, I guess, have another engagement with this thing formally, not just kind of the memory of the thing.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I want to hear how it came to be a part of FACSIMILE, which I think we're going to talk about in a little bit. But just sticking with the video for a moment, there's some
Sure.
interesting things we could maybe unpack with that. For instance, like you took the sound out of the video, right? You muted it when
Mhm.
it was displayed at Facsimile. And I was thinking about that kind of choice offers a sort of form of like mediation where like for me as a viewer, I become aware of myself viewing this thing rather than just immersing myself in the performance, you know, like you're kind of toggling that aesthetic switch in a way. And I was wondering about that choice.
I think for me, because when I was after the experience of being at Baker's, having that experience of Shirazette's performance, I don't know if what it sounded like is something that stayed with me, actually. I think the thing that kind of like stayed with me is what it appeared to be. And so the appearance of the thing is really what kind of fueled the formal decision to kind of remove the sound. It was like, well, I don't, as soon as kind of sound enters the equation, it becomes about that information kind of allows us to kind of have another kind of conversation that begins to be about like being able to identify an instrument, you know, being able to say, well, how many people are actually there? I think I hear like 5 instruments being played. Is that a violin? Is that a saxophone? Is that a trumpet? And all that other information felt like it was very much it will become very much about the performance um in a kind of one-to-one way. Like how can I be as accurate as documenting the things that are taking place on stage as possible? But for me, it wasn't that. It really wasn't about the sound. It really wasn't about kind of recording or documenting as a way to try and maybe create a document that felt factual to the event to then be able to share or pass along with somebody else, or even for me to have. It was more so about this other thing that seemed to be happening within the performance that felt like it was the thing that I was connecting to the most. And most of the time I spent even recording, and again, you know, it's my memory, so I don't know how reliable it can be. But when I think about it, I'm not remembering sound at all. I'm just remembering my body and the fact that I wasn't speaking at all to anybody for 8.5 minutes at the table. The fact that I was very much locked in on kind of Shirazette's face, and began to kind of be more so interested in this other thing that I thought was happening beyond the presentation, which was, you know, the band playing or something like this.
Or even the kitchen, for instance, which is so
Totally,
interesting, like to have this fluorescent light in the background versus these blue and red and like kind of flashing lights.
totally,
It kind of makes this comparison between both the drummer performing and the kitchen as both forms of labor, right? Like there's a way in which these are like it's a performance, but it's also kind of work that she's doing, and you see it
totally.
in her expressions and the way she's like moving her body. It kind of creates this interesting, like the way you've articulated the scenario in your video, like creates these kind of um, uh, conceptual ways of approaching the performance.
And it takes nothing away from kind of like the other things that were happening on, you know, on stage, if you will. I mean, those things were also very interesting things. But what I became acutely aware of was um, the former relationship that I thought was the most interesting, or the most kind of seemed to be, I don't want to use the word gratifying, but I felt the most, maybe one of the more interesting kind of formal relationships that were happening was with the door and the light. It
Mhm.
became about recording light at some point. So then my focus was about kind of just like, oh, I wonder how many people are going to come through this door right now. Are there more people kind of coming through this door that's allowing light to kind of travel differently or kind of interrupt whatever this other exercise of light that's happening on stage or kind of like outside of the kitchen? That the light that's happening in the kitchen becomes practical. Like I need the light there to kind of work in a way so I can kind of see the things I'm preparing. I can see kind of how I'm moving in the kitchen. That the blue and red strobe effect of the light becomes is not practical. It just becomes decorative. It becomes um, more so about kind of creating atmosphere in a way. And I'm interested in kind of like when these things meet each other. I'm very much interested in kind of like when a practical thing, like a light in the kitchen, can become something else. And maybe that's just from somebody coming in and out of the kitchen with a swinging door and having like this strobe light effect happening over Shirazette and the rest of the bandmates made that thing feel more like an event where something like art is happening. And so I think for me, once I realized that was happening, I was like, oh, well, what do I do? Which is the question I often ask myself, you know, as an artist. It's never for me wondering if art is happening is not the challenge for me. Is what to do with it once you realize it's happening is the challenge for me, actually. Like that's the part where practice kind of steps in. And so the moment where, you know, my hand is very kind of present in the video, it's merely just kind of like, oh, this is really interesting. Let me record this to share with my pops who's not there, maybe. But then something else happens where I recognize like, oh, this is more than just simply kind of a document to be shared. It's like an informational way to exchange an experience with my dad or something like this, who wasn't there. It became something else. And maybe the thing that allowed it to become something else was somebody coming in and out of the kitchen, you know? And so that's when I kind of like locked into place and being like, well, I think now that I recognize these things are happening, I think what I'm supposed to do is kind of sit here and be in it. And which is why I was there for a kind of, you know, whatever the time was, 9 minutes, 8.5 minutes, which is why I sat there. I was trying my best to kind of be in what I imagined was the happening, was this other thing that became available to me, which at first, I won't say that it didn't seem available. It wasn't a question of availability or not, but I think it was, I wasn't aware of its appearance. And I think a lot of times,
oh, go ahead.
No, I say a lot of times I think what ends up happening, what ends up becoming formalized in my practice is when the appearance of the thing reveals itself, so to speak, to me. And then I feel like I'm dealing just really with kind of the appearance of things or maybe the evidence of something. It's never really quite the thing, which is also something that I think this video helped me to kind of deal with a bit, which is how we got to facsimile months later. But when I first had the experience of being in Baker's that evening to making the video, not as a way to make art, but just because I wanted to kind of maybe share this with my brother or my pops. But then in that, something else happened that then made me realize, well, maybe art is actually happening here in this other kind, or maybe something is happening here. And maybe that's worth sitting in just a little bit longer. Now, what to do with that down the road, and they kind of like how to share that, how to exhibit that, how to practice with that became a thing that I only could articulate later on down the road.
Well, that's interesting to me, Devin, because you also create kind of happenings and events in your practice sometimes, right? And I'm thinking about the Renaissance Society event that took place or kind of after this video was made, I think.
Right.
And I'm curious if you
Go
could
to
talk.
the next slide.
Do you want to talk about
sure.
that a bit?
Yeah, no, I would love to. So everything that we're going through now is in chronological order. So part of the reason why, you know, when Max and I were talking about like how do we begin this conversation, although it's very much on the occasion of facsimile, and the thing that kind of grounded the installation that is facsimile at the Power Station Annex happened at Baker's Keyboard Lounge in March. So many other things kind of happened in between that time that maybe helped me kind of realize or actualize what would eventually be the installation. And so once again, if this thing happened in March, now we're talking kind of like in April, if I remember my dates correctly, that then there was an invitation to do this performance at the Renaissance Society. And when I was thinking about performance, I began to kind of go back to thinking about like, well, what am I being asked to do when I'm kind of performing, actually? Like when when you're invited by an institution to say, hey, can you come perform something? Like where I then kind of question, like quite literally, like how that's done. If I know I'm going there to kind of like to showcase or exhibit something that's supposed to be kind of temporary, or something that's supposed to be ephemeral, something that's supposed to be maybe engaging, something that has to be considerate of an audience or not, but all these things make it kind of like really quickly a very particular kind of trouble, I guess you would say, of what to do with that. And I also didn't want to feel like that trouble for me was having to work like architecturally with the space. If you've never been to the Renaissance Society, it's an incredible exhibition space located on the campus of the University of Chicago. And so much of the exhibitions that happen there feel like they're very much responding to kind of like, well, how do I deal with a room like this? How do I deal with the acoustics like this? How do I deal with a window like this? How do I deal with maybe this thing being also in like a lecture hall? All these things become kind of part of it, part of how one experiences the place. And maybe the best thing I thought I could do at the time to deal with that was to describe the room. And I told Karsten Lund, who was the curator there at the Renaissance Society, who invited me to participate. I told him, I said, I really want to just see if I can describe this room in a very kind of practical way. Like, how can I kind of like give or offer description to what I think this space is? And then came the other kind of like questions about objects. So what we're looking at now are benches and a tent and lights on the wall. The benches are actually, I'm going to use the word facsimile, are actually facsimiles of benches that have been used in a previous installation or previous exhibition at the Renaissance Society. And this is from years ago, but once that exhibition was over with, these benches were in the hallway outside of the exhibition space. So they were no longer kind of being asked to perform as an art object anymore. They were there just simply for sitting, like waiting for a class, waiting for the bathroom, waiting for a friend to kind of like come upstairs from outside the elevator. But they were just outside of the exhibition space. And I asked Carson if we could kind of bring those back inside to the space to kind of reactivate them, if you will, in the gallery, but realizing that there wasn't enough. And I didn't want to kind of introduce another vernacular, another language to the room. I just kind of wanted to kind of use what was already there. And so then I asked if we could kind of like fabricate like 10 more benches identical to the ones that are in the hallway. So what you see here is this kind of arrangement of benches. And it was important they were benches for me too, and not like chairs. I think I was interested in kind of like not trying to overdetermine direction, if you will, in a very practical way, the way a chair does. And that became important to me. And then the tent, what you're looking at is just another way to kind of like acknowledge to like, I'm not trying to kind of compete with, I guess, the space, but acknowledge that this space is big and all encompassing. I'm going to build something temporary, like a temporary shelter kind of inside of the space. If nothing else, that kind of creates this other threshold for people as they're kind of entering and exiting the space. And also, I didn't want to be in the room when I was describing the room. I didn't want it to be, I didn't want the work to be so much about me having to physically be there in another kind of way, for me to kind of be looked at as this is happening. I wanted me to be outside of the room as this was happening. And the canopy or the tent kind of gave another opportunity for that to happen. So, and it was important that this was another conversation that Carson and I had about like, well, do we purchase a tent or can we rent one? Because I really wanted it to be big enough to cover the entrance or the atrium of the Renaissance Society right below that exit sign. And I said, it's important that it's rented. We'll rent it. I don't, it doesn't need to be a thing that I keep. It doesn't need to be a thing that like, ends up becoming something kind of stored in my studio. I'm okay if this thing had practical use and still does, before and after kind of my use with it. Like that felt super important to me as well. And the same for the benches. It was important to me that some of these benches could go back into circulation in the hallway. So now instead of there being like two benches, maybe there's like three benches in the hallway. Some of the wood that were also being used to fabricate these benches were then used to kind of like fabricate work in the next exhibition that followed my performance. So all these things kind of, became conceptually important to kind of my dealing with the temporary, which is, as far as I'm concerned, also my description is also a very temporary kind of sense of like what I think is there, what I think is not there. If I also kind of go back to the Ren today and try to describe the room, I'm sure it would not be the same description it was like last spring or in April, whatever the case might be. So that's kind of what the setup was.
What's also interesting about the way you describe how you describe, like your practice of describing, is also one that is somewhat transformative too, right? That you're like producing these benches that then go on to have a life of their own. And I'm wondering about how you consider your involvement in the life of things. Like, do you feel like are these processes that you're setting up in motion, or do you feel like you're part of a greater process that's already happening?
Definitely a greater process already happening. I definitely feel like, which I feel a lot of relief in that. I do think there have been moments early on, maybe in the practice, that I thought I needed to kind of instigate everything. I thought that, it was my job as the artist to be a creator in a sense, and kind of taking that job and that responsibility in a particular kind of, in a way that made it about me that I felt really uncomfortable with. And I feel like with a disservice to what I think art is, actually. Like it needed me to make it happen or something like this. And so I think having another idea of, oh, there is this, I think I describe it actually in the text for Facsimile. I describe art as this kind of current, and all I feel like I'm doing is kind of working with the current, if you will. So it did feel important to me to kind of like acknowledge or be aware of kind of like the current or the vernacular, thinking about that video. I mean, I wasn't maybe thinking about the video, or maybe I was subconsciously, but thinking about kind of what it meant to be in Baker's in front of Shirazette, experiencing what I thought I was experiencing, and then realizing I was kind of in it, and then kind of like trying to figure out how to be in it a little bit, which is what I love about performance, that I do think I also really appreciate about sculpture. I mean, I think they both have spatial concerns. One feels maybe more urgent than the other, not more important, but I think the urgency of performance, because of just how it works and doesn't work, I think is something that always feels like I can't get away from. And sometimes like I do realize, and even in my sculpture practice, I think I'm always asking things to perform a little bit.
Min, can we show some more slides of this show so we can see Devin performing at the place?
I think the pictures here. So also what I want to say is we're going around, I think maybe the next slide. We can stop here for a second. So this performance took place over 2 days. And this is kind of like day one, this kind of configuration of the room. And you may have noticed there were speakers in various places. That is just so my voice is being mediated, through a microphone, a mixer. On the other side of this tent, inside of the atrium, there is myself and another curatorial assistant sitting across from one another, and they are operating the speakers for me, turning them on, checking the volume. At the beginning of this performance, I think we're trying to test the speakers, and there's an interesting moment where I always say test, usually in the beginning of something if I have to speak. I repeat the word test over and over again. And as luck would have it, like the speakers weren't working at first. So my test was like actually not part of the presentation of the performance, not kind of part of the bit, if you will. But it literally became a test all of a sudden to make sure that these speakers are working, which felt important too, to kind of make sure that word didn't kind of like lose its it loses practicality, that it didn't just become as something that I just rehearsed and something that kind of became like a way to kind of like to know the performance. You know, maybe for me, maybe my as a way for me to feel good about doing what I did, maybe saying the word test or something I've done before felt like a really good thing to kind of ground myself, to make me feel confident about what was going to happen. And then when the test actually became the thing where it's like I can't hear myself or I can't hear if the speakers are working. And then the test became literally trying to figure out how to do this thing right. Which I don't imagine most people in the room knew that at the time. But once I began to kind of like go through the tests, once it was like test really loud and the speakers at its highest volume, then I kind of went through testing the volume of each speaker for about a minute and a half or so. And then I went into the description of the corner, of the ceiling, of the window, of the ledge, back around again, from like one side of the room to the other, and then back. And then that was day one of the performance.
And could the audience see you while you were doing this?
No, I was, most people was interesting. So we set up this situation, which I think maybe men in the next slide, we might be able to see. Okay. So this is a good example. So Carson and I had decided that we would start the performance, I think like right at, I think it may have been like 7 o'clock or something like this. I can't remember the exact time. But at 7:15, we would stop letting people like enter the room, enter into like the main gallery space. And then I would come from the office and then I would just kind of now be inside the tent. I would now be inside the tent in the atrium room, which is you kind of get a bit of a sense here in this picture. And people kind of came in at 7:15 would just be on the other side of the tent, the other side of the room. They wouldn't see the kind of the setup in the exhibition space, but they would see me. They would see me kind of speaking. And there's a really interesting moment where I remember as I was talking, kind of giving the description of the room, somebody kind of came in maybe like at 7:20 or 7:25, let's say. And one of the rent staff was telling the person, oh, like, you know, you can't go inside the exhibition space, but you can sit here at this bench, which is like literally right in front of me. And he was becoming really frustrated and irate. Like, but I want to be able to go in and see, you know, the performance. And she kept trying to explain to him, like, no, but you are seeing the performance. This is also kind of part of it. And that didn't feel like that was enough. Like he wasn't part of the exhibition space. So that meant he wasn't part of the, you know, able to see the performance. And he, after he had said a few words to the Ren staff, decided to leave. But I don't know. That felt like one of those kind of things that I didn't anticipate that would happen. You know, it was more so kind of like a formal condition I was just trying to kind of set up.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting how similar to the video that we played earlier, there's this sort of what's visible, what's not visible, what's sonically available, what's not sonically available, information that you're playing with and the way that it's articulated to an audience. Yeah, it's very fascinating. Should we talk about the Neubauer? Should we talk about how we got there?
Sure, yeah, we can go through that real quick.
We can see
Oh,
some
this
more
is
pictures
another,
here.
yeah, this is another picture of me and Michael kind of inside the atrium, and then also kind of you can see the kind of the Tyvek wall there of the tent that then opens up into the room. But this is where I was doing all of my reading and my testing of the speakers from.
And then
You
wait,
go to
what
the
happened the second night, Devin?
Yeah, the second night, go to the next slide. I invited some musicians who I work with from time to time um, to be a part of day two of this performance, where I was asking them to also kind of help me describe the room, but maybe in other ways that they could maybe sound it offer me availability to a part of the room that I couldn't describe or couldn't describe well. And it was really kind of like an exercise in like trying to make noise. I mean, I think that was kind of the description I gave them. And you'll see here like the arrangement of the benches then changed. And maybe here in this picture you kind of see more The more kind of darker, richer, blonde colored benches are the ones that have been part of an exhibition from before. And my plywood benches are the ones that are kind of like mixing and surrounded. The tent opened up, and then now we were inside the tent and kind of trying to create as much density from our instruments as possible, and also kind of create as much space as much as possible, kind of within the room. The room is incredibly echoey. So in some moments of like playing dense meant that things were going to kind of bounce in very ferocious ways. And so then it meant kind of like being quiet, being still sometimes in other ways too, where maybe sound was able to kind of get places without kind of like trying to over-determine how they got there. And that was day two. So 2 days of description for me in various ways.
The benches were calling to mind. I saw you give a talk earlier this year in which you said there's memory and then there's what's remembered. And I've been thinking about that lately because the benches, this idea of like these benches existed, maybe someone, they perhaps existed previously, but now they're being remembered in a different way. Perhaps that's the kind of facsimile quotient of the reproduction. But the way you describe the space in 2 nights in 2 different versions, they're both perhaps equally descriptions, but the way that they're remembered or recounted is there's also this kind of transformative element to it.
And it was interesting too, because there's also the thing of like, if you came day two, you saw something very, it was a very different experience than day one was. And I remember there was a moment of trying to figure out how do we make sure people come to both days? Like, do we make sure people come to both days? So they get it, or they kind of get the full experience of what was happening. And I think at some point it was like, that felt, I mean, not that it was unnecessary, but it wasn't about if you missed this day or you didn't get this day, then you didn't get the thing. You got a description. Something happened. You know what I mean?
Right.
Kind of in the name of the same thing. And I don't think that felt super important to kind of my relationship to that work too, was like understanding that those are also the kind of the conditions of setting up a performance, for me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So anyway.
Should we talk about the Neubauer?
Yeah, let's do it. So no, go ahead. I'm sorry, Max.
No, I'm just curious. I was going to ask, like, what were your concerns and objectives here? Like, what was going on here?
This was a show that happened like right after. It opened May 1st, which is really important to the curator. It opened on May Day. And the curator had invited me to do this installation of palettes that I first did in the previous year at the SculptureCenter for an in-practice show. That I gathered palettes from around Queens. I kind of arranged them. I added other elements of shims or wedges or doorstops to kind of offer them some stability on the gravel, and they lived there in the courtyard of the SculptureCenter for the duration of the show. Well, something similar kind of wanted to happen here, where I gathered pallets from around Chicago inside these pallets or outside to kind of give them some stability. I had wedges, which have become like this recurring kind of practical thing that I use to kind of offer something balanced or stability. Shims were also there. And at the same time, once these pallets were kind of erected and placed onto the courtyard of the Neubauer Collegium, I think the big issue that the exhibition space had was would people recognize this as art, or would they kind of see it as a thing, and more so the facilities team, would they see it as something that needs to be disposed of? Would they take these and throw them away? Would kind of like onlookers say, hey, there's a stack of pallets here, I could use a pallet and kind of remove them? But our big focus was making sure people knew this was art they were looking at. And for me, I understand kind of when you work this way, and also when you work this way and you're not kind of, I'll say kind of like relying on the understanding that an institution kind of have the rules of the institution, when you're like literally just outside of them, then all of a sudden kind of the rules change immediately. Like if there's a stack of pallets inside a place with white walls, maybe one may not question them as much of their availability, of their accessibility, of their beingness, if you will. But when they're not there, all of a sudden they become something else. And so I remember that being a big kind of concern of like, how do we make sure that they don't throw these things away? So as luck would have it, I install the work. I go back down to Galveston. I get a phone call from the curator of the exhibition, and he's like, "Hey, the pallets aren't here. Did you move them?" And I say, "No, I'm in Texas." And he's like, "Well, they're no longer here." And my first thought was like, "Oh, the facilities threw them away," which is totally fine. You know what I mean? Like I'm not mad that they responded that way. But he was like, "I think actually they're being used in the encampment on the main quad of the University of Chicago's campus, which just started like since you left." And I was like, "Oh, that's interesting." He was like, "What do you want to do? Do you want to get more pallets?" And I said, "Well, I don't think that's the right call, actually. I think it should just be this is the work." And my hope was to ask the curator to create a lawn sign, a yard sign, which they were going to do anyway for the work. Like, hey, this is part of the exhibition that's taking place inside. The work is just out here. I was going to ask if we can make an amendment to that sign and say, well, the work that's part of this exhibition that was once here is now somewhere else, and kind of that somewhere else being the quad. But I never had the opportunity to do that because the next day the encampment was raided, and whatever evidence of the work of the pallets that were once there were no longer there anymore. So I just asked the day before, the day of, excuse me, I got that phone call about the pallets being removed. I asked a photographer in Chicago if they would go out and document these for me. So if you go to the next two slides, I think they're just kind of more details of where the pallets were. And then eerily enough, you know, once the encampment was raided by the University Police and Chicago Police, it had eerily some of the same resemblance of marks on the quad as well. And so this kind of was the work. But one did survive. You go to the next slide. I think there might be a picture of one more. So what we're looking at now are two pallets that were actually inside of the gallery that were not part of the two large installation stacks that were removed. And what you're looking at are those two wedges that are sitting inside of the pallet are there because they weren't needed to offer some sort of like balance. Like the floor was pretty balanced enough. So they're kind of resting inside the pallets, but these were the two things that remained.
You know, I think so much about the way you pay attention to things really gets me thinking about things around me as doing so much work. Like there's so many ways in which they do facilitate things in my life, and I'm thinking about like the history of things as a kind of not necessarily as nouns but as verbs, like the way they facilitate change and transformation, and the way this exhibition came together, the way you describe it, for instance, as you know, you sort of like taking a back seat at some point and letting the thing have its own life in this way in which it's moved around and goes from being a work of art that's perhaps this kind of the being of the thing is like as a kind of life of its own versus its practicality, its usefulness. I think that's really interesting how you just kind of let things go like as much. I mean, I'm curious about that.
I mean, for me, it's a part of it's just acknowledging the current, you know. And whenever there's moments, if you go to the next slide, this is the exhibition at GAR. GAR is the Galveston Artist Residency. I think there were moments where I could feel myself when I'm working sometimes that I would want to overdetermine the use of it. You know, I would want to overdetermine making sure that this thing is kind of like sculpture in a very particular way. And sometimes maybe, you know, figuring out how much you need to put into something can be metered in various ways, depending on what you're asking it to do. And I think just given the ways in which I've been working and given the kind of questions I have and maybe the things I'm asking these things to do, is really just to be a part of the current. I'm not asking them to actually kind of like outperform the current. I don't think you can. Um, and so because you can't outperform it, because you can't kind of work against it, well, how do I find a way to kind of like show up without it being about my attendance, in this particular way? And I think that's where everything from, and so then my hand becomes important in this other way for me. Well, how much of my hand needs to be present? I want to be responsible for these decisions I'm making. I also want to be accountable for what these decisions might actually become consequences for. But I don't need it to be so much about a kind of um, an exhibition of my ability solely. It's more so kind of an acknowledgement of the current is what I'm trying to do.
And I think this is a good example to ask you about the kinds of objects and spaces that you choose to draw attention to in the way that you work. I'm thinking about the light right here, for instance, that's hitting the back wall. I mean, that's so fascinating to me because one way to look at it is that it's a kind of absence or void, but personally, I look at it as like you're shining a light on this wall. It's like a structural support that perhaps is maybe taken for granted and sometimes, but here it's like really given a kind of place to be present. Like the absence is a present. And then these objects here on the floor, there's these kind of industrial standard issue chairs. We can go to the next slide, maybe. You can see
Detail, yeah.
bricks, there's wood. Um, it's like interesting, like I'm curious why you choose the objects you choose to work with in terms of materials. Like for instance, the palette that we just looked at. Do you see a kind of like a pattern?
Totally. I mean, some of it I think is just their availability to me. Honestly, it's like I think the economy of some of these objects um feels generous, maybe full stop. They feel, and in that generosity, I feel like I'm able to kind of work with them in abundance in a way that feels important to kind of like to working with the thing that feels like it's everything all the time, actually. That it doesn't become about kind of a like the exclusiveness of the material. It's not about a kind of like, oh, this is a very particular thing from a very particular place that only a very particular person kind of get access to. Now, maybe there are moments when those things become important as a way to kind of have a demonstration of, I don't know, whatever the kind of research or scholarship or idea might be. Again, but because my interest is in the current, I think for me it's important that these things feel almost kind of like there is an abundance. And that like the chairs that I'm using here go back to being chairs. It's also important for me that there is a sense of like, not with everything, but in a lot of things that it is not my ability to kind of like transform the chair that makes a sculpture. Like there's something else that makes a sculpture. It's not because I'm able to kind of like tear it apart and turn it into another object. There is something else there that allows it to have the idea of what this other thing can be. And it's important that it still reads as a chair for me. And in the sense of like, and maybe this is also why the things are like placed in a particular way. Like they're not, um, I try my best not to kind of introduce too many other tools that might begin to kind of introduce another vernacular outside of like leaning, laying down, placing, stacking, arranging. Like these things feel like they also have a certain kind of, if you will, pedestrianness that does seem available, in a way that doesn't overdetermine how I use them. That I rely on the ways in which these things can already be in the world.
But
So
there's
the
also,
very first, oh, God, I'm sorry.
there's something interesting in the way the way you articulate these things gives them this extra kind of potential or possibility that may not have been visible before.
Totally. Which might mean that like, I do think the reason why I think I do like sculpture, because I do think there is a certain because there is a kind of like, what feels like to me at least, there is a kind of immediacy um, physically that I have to deal with, when it comes to kind of space. There isn't a kind of passive use of the physical space in a way with when sculpture is being asked to perform. I think for me, understanding or giving so much nod to kind of like what's there and what's not there. Like, for example, like right now, one of the things I do, I'm also a teacher, and the room I'm in right now, where I'm having this call, is in the classroom we work in, and a lot of times I'll have students go out on walks. And when I go out on walks to kind of like gather material, I say to them like, try your best not to kind of like look for things as if they're art supplies already. You're just trying to kind of like have encounters with things out in the world, if you will. And some things you're able to bring back, but some things you can't bring back, and that feels important. It's not as if the things you're unable to bring back to the classroom with you are not in the classroom. They're here, just maybe not in a very particular kind of physical form. So it's important for me to think about the things that can be moved and the things that cannot be moved, the things I'm able to kind of like maybe facilitate, and the things I can't. Like, and it feels important that both those things are like actively always being made aware of to each other. This is something I've been saying a lot in another one of my classes, that it's important that art can be anything, and it's also important that art is not everything. Like, both those things need to be able to kind of like hold space for each other simultaneously in order for the current to work, in my opinion. In order for me to kind of understand having the experience with Shirazette and saying that like, oh, this is simply just something to kind of show my dad for later, and then it becomes something else, then it becomes something else. They can also kind of go back to being like, oh, this is also just like a really amazing experience I had with my family. It has no other kind of implications about like it needing to be a video, or like this chair that I'm sure is being used at GAR right now in somebody's studio. That it can also kind of do that feels important, or it can be asked to do this with some facilitation from people that call themselves artists, or maybe it doesn't need to be in my hand either. Maybe somebody else leaned the chair there, and I'm like, oh wow, look what somebody just did.
Yeah, I think like a really interesting gesture you did at this exhibition is the corners that you made, for instance, like the way you opened up this
Oh, can we go to the next? Yeah.
One more. One more. So there's that, and this one's, yeah, that one and this together. There's something about this creation of a corner that you were telling me about this when you were putting this show together, and how you were very interested in this idea of the corner. And I mean, I'm curious if you could say more about that, like how that appeared for you.
The previous slide, if you go to that, Min, thank you so much. It's it's a folded piece of cardstock, and the folded piece of cardstock was me trying to describe to Dan Schmall, who works at Galveston Artist Residency, describing what I wanted to do in this narrow kind of walkway. And I was like trying to describe, I was thinking about a wedge, and and really what I was doing was thinking about how often I've used wedges, whether they be door stops, maybe the head of an axe or something like this, to kind of like to use in these practical ways to kind of like uphold something. And I began to think about corners. I often rely on corners to like hold things up for me all the time. That they feel like kind of like an opportunity for like something else to happen. And that got me really interested in kind of like, how do and I always thought about them. I was always using them in a practical way. I was always asking corners to be there for me to lean something against. I was always asking corners to be there for me to kind of put things in, shove things in, maybe even forget about, maybe not forget about. But I never looked at them as a kind of like a material before. And I think there was something about when I was working on this exhibition, I became more interested in kind of corners being material and not just a kind of like a consequence that became practical for me to like perform sculpture in, or, do something else in. And so the prototype, if you will, for the corner in the next slide that you see in the wedge was that piece of paper, which ended up then being this thing you see here.
And if you go to the next slide, I think you can see it from the other side. So there's the same corner from the other space, adjoining space. And
Because that room didn't have a corner. Like that was also one of the things for me too. It was like, it's interesting that because that opening is there, there wasn't an opportunity for like a corner to happen. And so some of it for me too was like by building this wedge, I'm also getting a corner out of it, which not to put anything in, but just to have there.
And something I love
So,
about your work too is that you also like kind of like a math problem, you show your work, like the wooden panels on the floor there. Like it's kind of those are the wood pieces that you took out to create the corner, right? Um,
totally,
and
totally.
I,
And that's
and it's something that you do quite a bit. So, I mean, I've seen you do it multiple times. It's like this kind
yeah,
of show your work because it's like you're transparent about the process of how you got to the thing.
yeah. I never, I don't know. I think that part of me is into magic. I do like thinking about it, but I'm less so into magic tricks, maybe. I'm not trying to hide my hand. You know what I mean? It's like, um, I don't think I'm special because I do this, actually. I think so it also becomes a really interesting thing to have somebody kind of figure out where the work is. So like if I'm listing kind of like the elements or the materials in an installation, and I say, for example, this was like um, drywall and paint. It's like, are you talking about the wall, the corner, or the things that are leaning against the wall that are near the corner? Like it becomes this question about how to locate something too. I think which is why it's important sometimes for me to also show my work because it also like locating the thing also does kind of present, I think, a kind of disassociation in a way that I hope at least for me it does. It kind of like questions then when you're kind of inside of the thing, when you're kind of working with the current, when you're inside of kind of the event that is art or inside the event that is sculpture or whatever the kind of like form or material you choose. And so showing the work became a really important part of like whenever like fabrication was involved. It was like, well, I got to leave something here. You know what I mean? Like it's not just to show that that was part of the process. Also felt like super important
And,
conceptually to the work too.
showing the work too is something, another element of this exhibition was your the practice you had as a bar back at Daiquiri Timeout, which is a local bar there in Galveston. And you
Right.
wanted to make that part of this exhibition, and that's a kind of job that you performed. I was wondering if you could talk about that job and the relationship of it to this to your practice. And maybe we
It,
could go to
it
the next slide or two slides further to show one more. That one,
there
yeah.
you go. So, it's interesting. So a little backstory, I guess. When I was teaching at Rice in Houston, I moved to Galveston to do the Galveston Artist Residency. And literally, I want to say like the first week, maybe like the first couple of days I was there, um, the GAR folks, Eric, Dan, and Sally kind of took the residents out for drinks at a bar down the street. And I remember, for whatever reason, Dan kind of flipped over and said to me, um, Dan's the same guy who helped me with the installation and building the corner. He said, I think they're looking for a bar back on Wednesdays. You know what I mean? I have no idea why he suggested that to me, but I was like, yeah, sure, I'll do it. Of course. I'm also coming from a place of like, some of it for me was also just like, you know, the hustle economy that I'm so used to. I was like, yeah, of course I can have four jobs. Like, why wouldn't I? You know what I mean? I've never not had four jobs. And so some of it was just that. Another part of it was like, I think I could do this. And I felt so, the fact that I feel like I was being invited to do it kind of also gave me more encouragement, you know what I mean, to kind of like do the job. So I bar backed for really the entire time I was at GAR. Like that was kind of the consistent thing I did once a week. And then it ended up becoming like twice a week, three times a week. And I got super into the activity of like of being the support. I think one of the things I learned when I was bar backing was how important it was for me to be there and not be there at the same time. It was like a really good bar back knows how to always kind of like be around but never be in the way. And I think it was at this time when I began to work with balloons, actually. I think balloons for me became this other thing for me that I felt like were amazing. I mean, and balloons, to be more specific, me inflating balloons. In the previous slides, there, in that room where the corner is, there is a massive bag that used to hold gravel. This bag was holding, I don't know how many thousands of pounds of gravel for the SculptureCenter show. That same bag is now filled with balloons I inflated. And of course, over time, the bag changes, air escapes, or it doesn't. I mean, I still have some of those balloons like in my apartment now that have just a little bit of air in them still. But there was something about kind of like just like labor, which I think is a word that you had mentioned, that I was really interested in. And I think having these experiences kind of happen simultaneously for me, or kind of being the bar back, which felt super important to me. And not as an art project, like not to kind of step in as being like, oh, this is a performance, never wanting to use bar backing as an excuse for any kind of like studio or anything, but to really kind of get into the making and really get into kind of what it meant like to be there as the support staff. Um, and that allowed me, I think, to have a different relationship with how I think things should be practiced, how things work. And this picture right here is just kind of like one of the stations. So I think I was having, and it didn't really hit me until I think maybe probably 6 or 7 months into kind of working at the bar, how significant this was for me outside of the bar. Like I became hyper focused. I like really wanted to perform well at the job and support my coworkers. But then I realized how important this was to like to my life, and making that picture felt like a really important kind of way to just to kind of have remember what that time was like sitting there. Kind of that's one of the workstations I had. So that's what you're looking at.
And so all this while, you're doing more shows. You've got this show in Vienna that you put together, and some of the materials you've used before recur, like the palette, the tint here shown contracted that was not the same tint, but a similar tint to the Ren, right?
Yeah.
And and uh, I see Min's moving us along. And then we get to Facsimile, and you find a home for the video you made
Right.
at Baker's. And I'm wondering if we can talk about what Facsimile, what that type. Maybe go to the next slide for a minute. And so this is where Facsimile exists at the power station. And I'm wondering if you could talk about like how this came together, where the title comes from, and why you thought the video made sense here.
The previous slide of the person holding the wedge, yeah. That was kind of the promo image we used for Facsimile. And when Greg Rupp of the power station, who also runs Picnic Curatorial, which is responsible for programming the annex of the power station, which is what we're looking at right now, had invited me to do a show. I was thinking about the video. We were actually having another conversation about, I think just, I want to say jazz musicians in general. And it jogged my memory about this video or that experience that I had. I never referenced the video. I never said that I recorded. I just said, oh, there's this thing that happened. And I remember when I was thinking about like what to do with this experience and this video that I had, it had me thinking about how I feel like as artists, or at least for me as an artist, it feels like the things that I feel like I'm dealing with most of the time are never it's never the thing itself. It never feels like it always feels like it's of the thing. it always feels like it is, by the time it gets to me and I understand it as material, it's already had its life. So then this is why I say in the beginning of the conversation, why I feel like, the art part is not hard. It's like what to do about it is hard, actually. Like what to do about this thing that feels like it will exist with or without me. Um, it can be it can be anything, but it should not be everything. And also is not kind of there for me to kind of demonstrate my ability to kind of like translate it or make it do what it's already doing. So it's like, how do I deal with that? Now that I feel like I have this kind of, I'll say acute sensitivity, what I'm saying, to the current. And I think I felt some relief even in saying that, like, oh, because then there came the question about exhibition. I'm always interested in being like, well, then where the hell does exhibition come from in this process? You know what I mean? There's practice and then there's kind of like exhibitionism. And so I felt like when I was thinking about how all those things kind of conflate or work with each other or against each other, it got me thinking about that video and that experience and realizing that like the closest I will ever get to something is a description, maybe, to the thing, is being able to describe it. The closest I'll ever get to the current is a kind of like awareness of the things that move through it, but not the current itself, which feels important. And so then all of a sudden, I felt like the video felt like it was just a facsimile of this other thing that I was experiencing. It was just derivative of it. And that feels important actually to understand that in order to even understand what the thing is, there needs to be enough space to describe what the thing was. And what that space is, or what became of that space was the video. What became of that space was a description. And I used to kind of fight that. I used to always, use the word present all the time. Like it's about being present, the presence of this, the presence of that. And I think I used to think about there is a oneness to that there is a kind of one-to-one relationship with the thing being present and the thing having presence. But have a better understanding of kind of this video and what I experienced in the video, me, Devin, kind of like recording, and then Shirzette, and then the wait staff of bakers moving in and out of the kitchen, or the light, or the strobes, or whatever the case might be, is that it's never a one-to-one relationship in that way. It is never kind of, the relationship is not collapsed. There is a little bit of space and just enough space in order for one to be aware of what's happening and what's going on. And that kind of grounded my decision making for like what to do in the space. And so what we're looking at now is the interior of the exhibition space in the annex. And for those of you that have never been to this space before, if you'll notice, the ceiling of the exhibition space has a very particular kind of like species of wood. And that's how all four walls, or all, excuse me, two walls of the space look. The floor is the same. And the very first thing I wanted to do when I asked Greg if I wanted to do was like carpet the entire space and like cover the walls with utility board. And part of the reason I wanted to do that is because I felt like when I was dealing with this thing, this facsimile of this thing, trying to understand kind of like what I'm supposed to do with this video, if it means anything at all, I felt like another gesture that I needed to have happen in that space had to be practical. Carpeting the floor. It wasn't being asked to kind of like perform as art. It wasn't being asked to kind of do anything else, but kind of like have this other relationship to the floor that was kind of, that wasn't about dealing with the current, but could become a part of it, maybe.
There's
because
also
of the video.
There's also this interesting way in which what you've done here is also kind of, you could say, is a form of tracing or describing, right? Like we talked
Totally.
about, but you're describing it, and we know you're describing it because of this disconnect between the ceiling and the walls, right? That you choose to describe it with your wood, your carpet. Like these are choices you've made that also like imply your presence.
And also, it's one of these things, if you've never been to the space, you don't know that's not what it looks like. You know what I mean? So like most people, if they did go to this space, one of the things that Greg and I spoke about is like, they may just not know that anything happen to the walls or the floor. They may just assume that this is what the walls and the floor look like, which for me is okay. That there are these moments that people were like, I'm not quite sure what I should be looking at. I'm not quite sure where the thing is. Feels like I'm okay with that tension in the work. Even right down to trying to selecting the hardware for the nails, for the hardware for the walls. Like, do we use nails? Do we use screws? What kind of screws do we use? All that kind of information became like really important to kind of how I think the art gesture kind of came out of this, but doesn't always won't always be recognized as kind of being like as the art thing that's there. What people can immediately recognize as like maybe the art is being the video on the floor. But if you go to the next couple of slides, there's the example of the excess carpet rolled up that's also in the space. But the stool, which became like a really like big part of the conversation. I remember like I really wanted there to be a place because the video is 8.5 minutes long. I wanted there to be a space for people to maybe like have an opportunity to do something else with their body. And so the stool had me thinking about maybe the bench and how much it resembled the bench to me. But at the same time, I knew that for me, I didn't want this thing to kind of like I didn't want to kind of I didn't want it to kind of pronounce itself in a very particular way. Like this is kind of like another kind of gesture. I wanted this to be the thing that's either underneath the kitchen sink or the thing that's in the garage. I wanted to kind of like read as a kind of other like a practical thing, a practical tool being placed in this room in a particular way. So some people chose not to address it at all. Some people kind of moved around it. Some people just thought maybe somebody left this thing here. It's not supposed to be here. But the stool for me became like the last kind of like element that felt like it was interested in having a formal relationship or an awareness of the carpet, the utility board, in a way that allowed like the video on the ground just to be the video and not anything else.
Well, Devin, I think everything you've said has been really amazing to hear. And I think you've shed so much more light on your practice and helped us understand new ways of thinking about describing and relating to objects and spaces and environments. And I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for the questions. I appreciate it. Sorry if we ran over or anything like that, but it was good to kind of hear myself say some of these things out loud again, I guess.
Yeah, we really all enjoyed hearing you talk through all your processes. We have some questions from the audience. The first question is from Pia. Could you speak a bit about your engagement with material flows in relation to the time as an intermediary between the object and the work of art?
If I understand your question correctly, it's about maybe the process that happens between kind of something being between like I don't know, a trash can just being a trash can, and a trash can being like a found object. I'm assuming is kind of like what that time is, if you will, or what that process is like for me. And that's not your question, I'm sorry. That's how I understand it, at least. I don't know if I have a sense of what that time is, to be honest with you. I don't think as I'm sitting in this room, I'm looking at all the things that are here, a broom, a table, a bucket, a chair. They don't read to me as found objects. They don't read to me as maybe something that's kind of been canonized. They just read to me as the trash can is there. And there's something else that needs to take place in order for like the other thing, that maybe the art, for art to appear, even if it's already there in some capacity. You know what I mean? I don't think it's like it shows up in its objectness, maybe, which is why I'm into things, which is why I use that word so much to try to describe, I think, an experience or describe an encounter or describe a form. Because maybe a thing kind of wrestles with some of that intermediary that you're maybe you're referring to. Um, but as far as kind of like what that experience, what that time is like for me, I think it varies depending on kind of where I am, where I meet it, and where it meets me. Sometimes it feels like it really kind of reads this thing. Other times it doesn't. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. The second question is from me. I was wondering if you can speak a little bit more about multiplicity or multiplicity you use with found objects. It seemed like there's the sense of collectivity, not just through your performance and bodies of like audience, but like almost like a collectivity of objecthood. I was wondering if that's a decision you make. You seem to have a really collaborative practice with the objects you encounter and the places you go, and whether that decision is also collaborative or it's an intentional decision to use multiplicity of forms.
That's a good question. I would say for me, usually the kind of multiplicity in some ways shows up just because I repeat myself a lot. And I feel like repeating myself is important. Even sometimes when that repetition becomes clumsy and feels more redundant, it feels important. Because it's also for me that multiplicity or that repetition or that redundancy, it reminds me that I'm not trying to kind of like, I'm not working this way to achieve a certain kind of, it's not a goal-oriented process, that is about achieving something kind of beyond maybe the same question. One of the things I think about is like, well, what if, you ask yourself, you go through this series of questions or processes only to realize you're back at the same question. It's not as if that question wasn't a good question. It's just maybe it needs to be asked a million times. Like maybe that's actually kind of the point of it, is to kind of repeat this thing over and over and over again. And so I think in order for me to kind of do that, feel good about maybe that level of repetition for me or redundancy for me does come from a kind of collective observation, which does feel like a collaborative thing. So in a very literal sense, when it's like, I often engage when I'm working with people, I often bring them into the room. I'm like, well, can we talk about this actually? When it came time to the show in Vienna, that had we quickly went through that had the pallets leaning. One of the things I had to realize is that, in Vienna, I couldn't get access to pallets the way I can like in Chicago or Houston or New York or other places. That um, it required other people helping to kind of like source things for me in a way that doesn't feel like it should not be a part of the process. Like it's not a thing that gets hidden. It's not like not showing the work. And so the pallets that were there when I arrived to Vienna, they were almost in the same exact place they're in now. They were just stacked. And when I got there, I leaned them against the wall, and I thought about other kinds of iterations of feeling like, well, I could like do something other kind of interesting kind of move with them, but I'm also not interested in kind of moves. Like, I don't think for me, my practice is about coming up with like a series of clever moves to make and get really good at. Well, my practice feels like a more about a kind of learning how to kind of make decisions and being responsible for those decisions, like, and understanding kind of the consequences that come from those decisions. So for me, in the example of the Vienna thing, it felt important that like those things didn't get moved again. That wasn't necessary for them to get moved again. They just needed to be there. And so, and maybe that whole exhibition even, and because I can only borrow things for that exhibition, then the tent became important. It was like, well, how do I get a tent? And then we tried to trace one down. They were like, well, if we buy one and return it later, it's not the same thing as being borrowed. Like the pallets are being borrowed. And so there just happened to be one of the gallerists was attending a birthday party that had a tent for their birthday party. And after the birthday party, they were like, well, can we bring the tent back to the gallery? And then we'll return it back to the person at the birthday after the exhibition is over with. And so some ways, like I literally need other kind of people to kind of help be in this with me in order for the work to like happen, which also feels like super important and which allows it to kind of have a life, multiple lives, which allows it to kind of like have a more, how would you say, that in the moments of like repetition, I don't often use the word collecting, only because I feel like when I get into the practice of building a collection, it does become about me amassing something very specific. It does become goal oriented in a very particular way, which I don't think these things are. I hope that gives you some answer.
Yeah, thank you so much. And our last question is from my colleague, Mackley.
Thank you, Devin and Max, so much. This was so fascinating to listen to, and I'm so excited to get more into your work, Devin. I'm very curious about your idea of this current, and I wanted to know, when do you know to tap into the current and tap into the flow versus like just observing it? How does that work for you?
I think for me, I think I may have mentioned this before about exhibitionism. And I think reminding myself, as flat-footed as it might sound, reminding myself that this is a practice, you know, I'm not practicing to be an exhibitionist necessarily. That the thing that kind of drives the work is the thing that probably doesn't get seen most of the time. And so sometimes I think the desire to kind of like instigate or the desire to make sure that there's something for you to do about the thing that's happening, to step in, has something to do with also my ability to kind of exhibit it later, to share with people that like I did this thing or I'm doing this thing. And sometimes the hardest thing to do is just to realize like, oh, this thing doesn't need me at all. And I'm so happy that it's happening or it's there already. And maybe all I have is just getting back to description. Maybe all I have is just kind of like the description to say to somebody like, oh, there's this thing that happened or there's this thing that I saw. And sometimes like, you know, I can't say that I'm good at that process either. There are some days when like, you know, my ego wants me to be an exhibitionist. Absolutely. You know, and there's some moments when I'm also like, I do struggle with trying to decide like if this thing needs me at all, you know. I'm gonna go back and forth. But I think that tension or that awareness feels important to how I stay engaged with the current because it allows all those things to happen. It allows me to kind of have the space for feeling like, oh, this thing, you know, doesn't necessarily need me, but maybe it's inviting me to participate. And maybe what do I do with that? You know, maybe this thing also is not asking me to, it's just asking me to kind of be an observer and maybe acknowledge that it's happening. And I'm okay with that too. But I don't always get it right either. You know, there are totally moments when I'm on either side of that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Devin, would you like to close us out with a reading or?
Right, that's right. Okay, I'm gonna try to get through this. So one of the works that Max and I briefly spoke about was at the Neubauer Collegium. And I mentioned about the pallets being removed during the encampments that were taking place. And one of the things I really wanted to do was write a letter to the members of the encampment. And I never got the opportunity to do that. Well, I never got the opportunity to send them the letter. I wrote a letter, but I never got the opportunity to kind of like share it with them. And I have to acknowledge Amy Powell, who is a curator based in Chicago or based at University of Illinois at Urbana, who met with me around the time this was all happening and was really curious about this letter which again, I started writing, but never kind of thought about it again because I never had the opportunity to share. I never knew if there'd be an opportunity to share. But because of our conversation and because of this conversation, I thought this would be a great opportunity to kind of share the letter that I never got a chance to send to the people of that encampment. So here it is. Dear encampment community, I hope this letter finds you all safe, energized, and resilient. My name is Devin T. I'm an artist based in Galveston, Texas. I am writing you for two reasons. First, in support of your protest. I believe in holding institutions accountable for the well-being of the people they're meant to serve. Furthermore, I believe in protesting the disservice or destruction of anyone, anywhere. Secondly, I am writing in hopes of forming, albeit informal, a more intentional relationship between myself and the members of your community. At the moment, our relationship is merely incidental. A series of unrelated consequences brought us together. Although I am grateful for these occurrences, I am hoping to bring forth more intentional encounters. I was a student at the University of Chicago in 2014. I was in the Master of Fine Arts program in the School of Humanities. During that time, Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, Laquan McDonald, and Tamir Rice were all murdered. I know there were more. These were the names that made the news. As you can imagine, there was anger, sadness, frustration, confusion, and even apathy in the air. I skipped classes to walk, march, stand, and lay in the street. Some people joined in protest, others did not. This is not a judgment. This description is merely an attempt to illustrate atmosphere. Reflecting on those days and observing the ones I'm living in, you become acutely aware of the presence of bodies, the presence of things presence, and the presence of things not. Earlier this year, I was invited to participate in an exhibition at the Neubauer Collegium. My contributions were 2 stacks of pallets placed in the courtyard just behind the building. Underneath each stack were shims, wedges, and wooden blocks. Inside each stack was a large ratchet strap. The work was called Untitled, Unnamed. Days after the work was installed, it disappeared. Already in Texas, the curator of the exhibition and my partner updated me on the status of the pallets. They were being used to barricade a newly formed encampment on the main quad of the University of Chicago. Now, there was only brown grass where the pallets once were. I was asked if this new news was upsetting. It wasn't. It still isn't. The gesture was something I welcomed. As an artist, I'm always grateful when the work goes beyond my expectations and introduces alternate realities. We now share a material. I believe we also share spatial concerns. I hope we can share more. I would like to talk to you, collective or individual, about how we can continue to make this a meaningful collaboration. Please note, I do not want this to distract from the significance of the matter at hand. I only want to work together. If this is of any interest, please feel free to contact me via cell or email. I would love to talk about what happens next. Sincerely in support, Devin T.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you, Devin and Max, for such a great conversation. Thank you, Greg, from Picnic Curatorial Projects and the Power Station team for their support in preparing for today's event. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible. and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rail's YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. Support our work through the link in the chat. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Paul Gray and Phyllis Tuckman on the over 60-year history of the Gallery Gray. You can now turn on your microphone and say goodbye as you leave.
Thank you.
Thank you
Everybody,
so
take
much.
care today. Much love to you all.
Thank you so
Take
much.
care. Thank you.
Thank you so much
Thank
for
you,
this
Devin.
great
Thank you.
discussion.
Thank you,
Really,
Max.
Thank you,
really
Devin. Thank you,
appreciated it.
Max.
Thank you so much, Devin and Max.